Welcome to another episode on the Phoenix Rising podcast. Journeys of descending into the mysteries and rising from the roots. I am your host, Lisa Hillier, spiritual mentor and priestess. I have guided hundreds of women and men into the mysteries within them to rise rooted into their sovereign selves. And today I have Mary Reynolds on the show with me. Mary is the youngest woman to win a gold medal at the prestigious Chelsea Flower Show. She is the author of The Garden Awakening and the newly released book, We Are the Ark. Her life has been the inspiration for the film Dare to be Wild. She is an ex-garden designer who believes everything must change. And so we must reimagine and rebuild our relationship with nature. This episode is full of so much inspiration on reconnecting to the earth that holds us, to healing the soil, and coming into deep communion with the wild magic that is all around us and in every single breathing moment. Can't wait to sink into this episode with you. Podcast, and I am here with Mary Reynolds today, and Mary is the author of The Garden Awakening, and it is one of my most favorite books, and I love the return to the wild magic of the land. So I'm very excited for this conversation. So welcome, Mary. And to start, we'll start with what has been the journey that has led you to the work that you're offering the world today.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, it's been a long journey. So I guess it's been there's quite a number of stages to that. But to try and summarize it really quickly, um, I I grew up in Ireland in a small farm, and I was the youngest of six children, and my parents had full-time jobs as well as being farmers. So I made my connections with the world of nature as opposed to people, because there wasn't that many of them around. Excuse me, my daughter is giving me a cup of tea. Thank you. Thanks very much. I don't want this, but thank you. So, and then I disappeared into kind of the world of teenage world, and parties and all sorts of crazy things. And I ended up doing landscape design in college, um, and didn't really enjoy it, but I found my way in it. And then eventually I realized that I kind of wasn't helping nature, I was hurting nature. And nobody would let me do a design like I was imagining, which was with wild plants and native plants. And so um, it was kind of an Irish angle. And I went to the Chelsea Flower Show, which was the only kind of flower show I had heard of, which is this big flower show in London. And it's kind of where people go to, and it sets trends in landscape design and stuff. But I was very young, and I got a gold medal at that, which brought me into an international career. And then somebody made a movie about that, and so that was called Dare to be Wild. It was a very sweet, kind of simple film, and they wanted me to write a book of the story. And I kind of started, and then I got bored with it, and because I had talked to the screenwriter about it, so I didn't really want to keep repeating myself. So I started writing about my work, and I wrote myself out of a job fairly quickly. And that's where the Garden Awakening came from. I had to reimagine how to design gardens which allowed the land to become what she wanted to become, as well as creating spaces for ourselves. And then one day, a good few years later, I was sitting at my desk and looking down over my garden, designing a space for somebody, and I realized something else shifted, because I watched a fox run past and two hares chasing the fox, which is all backwards. And it was daytime, it was winter, and I kept watching, and I saw a little hedgehog scuttling along. they should have been asleep, and certainly it's not, they're nocturnal creatures. So I went outside to see what was wrong, and I went down to the end of my little lane, which was a country lane in Ireland. And there was this thicket of a field on the far side of the little road, which was just wide enough for one car. And nobody ever went in there. It was completely wild. It was about an acre of land. It was full of brambles and gorse and prickly trees like hawthorns and blackthorns, and it was impenetrable. And somebody had got planning permission to build a house at the top of the field, and they'd gone in with a digger and they'd cleared it all out within an hour, I guess, without any thought for all the creatures that called it home. And so they had nowhere left to go. And I stood there in absolute horror, because that was something I had done myself so many times without consideration of our shared kin. So I went inside and I thought about it, and I thought, where are they going to go? All these wild creatures, where are they supposed to go? They can't go into our woodlands, because certainly in Ireland, our woodlands are now commercial crops. They're not actually woodlands anymore. Um, they're not native. They're just stands of non-native, very, very chemically supported trees, which, don't support life really. And they can't go into agricultural land because it's sprayed so much, and all their little habitats are disappearing. So their only hope is these little wild places, these little islands. And they can't go into our gardens because they're full of non-native plants, which have not evolved within the local food web, and they're too tidy and neat, and they don't support any life really, other than the ones we've decided are acceptable to our eye.
Mm.
So then I started We Are the Ark, which is acts of restorative kindness to the earth, and I'm asking people to take as much of any land they have under their care as they can spare, and give it back to nature, to ark it, to it's like a mini rewild, um, to try and restore a native plant ecosystem with as many supports for um, our wild creatures as possible. And that's what I do now, is I design those sorts of spaces that really, if we don't need the space, then give it back.
Mm.
You can create spaces within these arcs, but you don't need to make them pretty. I think that time for gardens is over. I think the time for treating land as some kind of a creative um, blank palette for our visions, that's gone. That's part of an old world, and we're birthing a new world at the moment here. And part of the release, we're letting those things go. One of the things we have to let go is gardens. So
Mm.
I think people need to start growing their own food without chemicals, and give the rest of any land they have back to nature. And nothing else makes any sense to me anymore.
Yeah. Can you explain to the listeners the difference between kind of your standard garden that would have been at like the Chelsea garden show, and what your garden represented in that show?
That was back in 2002. So the garden I did back then was instilled with very strong intentions, because I understood even back then that if you ask the land to hold a particular intention in a space, it will do that. So I had all the people building it. I had told them all that when they're building it, that they've to remember that this garden is being built to remind people of the importance of wild places.
Mm.
And it was built with lots of symbolism in the shapes and patterns that are harmonious to nature, and lots of kind of, I suppose, magical ideas. As far as I'm concerned, the world of magic, world of nature, um, all those other worlds which we have chased away in the last 50 years, they need to come back to balance out everything again. So the idea of what I did was I created a very, very natural space, which also had a lot of symbolism in it, and I pulled on a lot of mythology, and it had stone thrones on the north, south, east, west axis, and they were sitting around a pool of water. And our ancestors in Ireland used to believe that water held the magic because the sun set into the water, so the water held the light, the magic, the power of the sun and the moon in its turn. And so they thought that was a very powerful um, element. And then I had a bowl for a fire, a stone bowl which held fire in the center of that pool. And so you sat around this kind of magical space, and then there was simply a rath, which is like a donut of earth around the back of that, covered in wild plants. And there was hawthorn trees surrounding that, and then dry stone walls. And it was all just wild plants. And there was a beautiful moon gate, like a circular stone
Mm.
um, entrance, which also had a reflected circle on the ground. And that was reminiscent of uh, the, a symbol called the Vesica Pisces, which is two circles crossing at their points, and it creates a particular shape in the center. And the person, there was a line that goes through that, and the person walking into the garden, it becomes that line, and it's the connection, it's the crossover between the natural and the spiritual world, and that's what I tried to create there.
Yeah, I saw the movie Dare to Be
Ah,
Wild. I
okay.
love it. It's so beautiful. Such a beautiful story. And seeing the garden and what it felt like for me was almost like going into a portal of myth and folklore and the other world, which is kind of the old ways of what existed in this world on the earth. Like when you go to Stonehenge or Avebury and the stone circles, there's such intensity and energy there. And that's what it felt like seeing this beautiful, wild magic garden space that you had created in
Yeah.
London.
But you see, that's the thing, those places were created with intention.
Mm.
And that's why they have that energy. And you can do that anywhere on your own land, by believing that you can, and using words or using stones or using water to instill that intent into your space. And the land will respond, and it will be as magical as you want it to be. It could be a healing space, it could be a fun space, it can be a portal space, it can be whatever you want it to be. Everything is possible. Um, we've just forgotten that the world of magic is available to us.
I love that the world of magic is available to us because that's what it felt like seeing that movie and reading the book, The Garden Awakening, as well as just that opening to the world of magic where fairies are alive, the elements are alive, the trees are alive, the world is
Mm.
just thriving and speaking to us in every moment. Could you speak to, does anything come to mind of gardens, our typical lawns, and kind of this manicured way that we've been living, why that came into being? What was the purpose of that? And how do we take that? Because we all kind of have a lawn. We have our typical standard backyard. How do we start to wild that up and create magic in what already exists there?
Sure. Um, well, lawns were a status symbol.
Mm.
And it was really only something that the wealthy could afford, because anybody who had any land under their care had to use that land to grow food. So it only started to become a status symbol really in the 1900s, when the middle classes kind of got to the point where they were buying food, and they were growing their own food as well, but they didn't have to do as much of it. And they had any land they had left, they turned into a lawn around their house. It was a way of saying to their neighbors, "Hey, look at me, I'm doing well,"
Mm.
and um, it's just clung on. So it's this weird concept that we have, that neatness equals care, when actually what neatness is doing in nature is suppressing life and suppressing magic, suppressing energy. Um, and so, there is a place for lawns, because in arcs, what I ask people to do is to create as many layers of ecosystem development as possible, ecosystem maturity, because, you know, if you want to really restore a working ecosystem, you'd need about 1,500 acres minimum. So in a small garden, people can't obviously bring back wolves and all the creatures that we've taken out of the system to allow it to be a working system. So in a simple way, um, the only way to have to support as much life as possible is to have as many of those layers as possible. So our job is to step in and become the wolf, become, the beaver, become the badger, become, the wild boar, become whatever creatures you have in your own part of the world that maintain the web of life. And so one of those um, levels of ecosystem maturity is mown grass, or you know
Mm.
a lawn, really, because the large herbivores would always have had mown, kept some areas short, and then you'd have a meadow, and then you'd have scrubby areas like thorny areas, and then you'd have woodland, and then you have lots of things in between there. And you can have so many different types of ecosystems depending on the part of the world you are, and you try and develop them in order to support life. But if you have a lawn at the moment, over here it's much easier. It depends on the situation, but if it's like, if you have a new lawn and you're about to sow it, don't sow it. Don't sow grass into it. you know um Now, there is a problem in the States and in Canada, because you guys have had such an invasion of non-native species that are, plant species, um, that the soils are kind of infiltrated everywhere. And you have to kind of remove those in order to support life, because the non-native invasive plants have not evolved within the context of their local food web, and they haven't got the checks and balances that they would have in where they're from.
Mm.
They haven't evolved as food sources for any of the native insects, and they take over and they suppress um, an ecosystem reestablishing. So the first thing you would have to do would be to take them out and to
Mm.
keep them out. And so if you are lucky enough not to have any in your soil, and then you kind of just let what's there come up and you mow it, and it'll be a really interesting, diverse, short arced lawn. And then you have a meadow, and you only keep as much of it as you need. you know Keep the area around your house short, because you kind of, it makes sense, um, from lots of reasons, from fire break reasons to keeping mice, and other little creatures away from the house. It makes a lot of sense, just practically. And then you have your meadow, and then you have your scrub layer, and then you have your wood layer, and you might only get to have 2 layers in there. And then you add in all sorts of other supports for life within that, like water and stone piles, dead wood piles, and all sorts of things.
Mm.
Now, if
Dead
you don't,
wood.
yeah, sorry, if you don't have the option to allow what's there to come out, then your second best option is to um, collect wild kind of wildflower seed locally, and
Mm.
get a mix of native grasses and native wildflower seeds. Just make sure you're allowed to collect them. Depends on the situation, and then use that to sow. Because not only is it important that it's native, it's also important that it's local, because local provenance actually has a huge impact on an ecosystem. Like, a lot of the insects have evolved within kind of a 10, 15 mile radius of where they are, and their tongues might be too short or too long for a flower or a plant that they're used to feeding from, if you bring it in from further away. So Then the next best layer again is to order organic native wildflower plants, seeds, and native grasses, and sow them, and then keep them mown. Be the herbivore.
Mm, okay. So if you have already, kind of a lawn that's existing, it would be to start to bring in native plants to the
It,
area,
it would be, say that again. Sorry,
to
if you
bring
have
in like native plants, native grasses to the area.
yeah. So you might have to kill off the existing sward, and you can
Mm,
do that by covering it with, um, cardboard and stones or old carpets, or just don't use chemicals. You know,
mm,
if you have plastic, you can use plastic. Cover it with dark plastic, black plastic, if you have any, and it won't take long for it to kill off anything underneath it. Just don't use chemicals, please, because they're killing everything in the soil, and you're being told that they're not dangerous, but they're so dangerous. And they're not only killing everything in the soil, they're water soluble chemicals, and they go into our system, and they're in our rain, they're in our breast milk, they're in everything, and they're killing the bacteria in our guts, and they're causing untold problems in our world. So try
mm.
if you can.
Yeah. So with that, bringing back in native plants into into our lawns, into our backyards, all that kind of stuff. What does that do for the soil? Because as I understand it right now, our soil is not healthy and it's creating a lot of the destruction that we're seeing on the planet because our soil isn't fertile. It's like crying for moisture and water and fertility and life. And so does that do anything to the soil, bringing in the native plants?
Yes, I mean, if your soil is dry and you're dealing with dry lands, is that what you mean? It's desertification. I mean that.
Hmm.
I mean, there's wonderful organizations all around the world who are very, very capable of dealing with this, and there are things like ecosystem restoration camps and Jeff Lawton's Permaculture Institute in Australia, and they just basically they find the contour lines on your land, as in, find the lines that are level, and then they dig out swales, like, which are basically little ditches, and then
Mm.
they put the soil on the lower side of that. And they also, if you can't do that, they use stone ditches or dry stones, just hold anything you can do to, that when the rain does come, that you get to hold it on the land rather than washing it away. And that's just the first step to rebooting an ecosystem on dry lands, is try and hold the water on the land when it does come. And that usually then, along with mulching very heavily, um, planting pioneer species, native plants, is how people start to reboot an ecosystem in places like what you're describing. It's all about slowing the water down and holding it on site as much
Mm.
as you can. And it raises the water table and gives a chance to the land to restore itself. Um, you can also make compost teas, to restore the bacteria and fungi and viruses, everything that needs to be there that we've killed off with chemicals and um, monocultures, and the communities of plants that should naturally coexist, um, are deeply related to the life beneath the soil, Um, and so, there's approximately, they reckon 8.7 million species, different species on the earth, and we only know and have documented 1.2 million of them, and there's a whole, there's
Wow.
most of those are down beneath us, and so soil recovers so quickly when you cover it. You don't dig it, you never dig soil, um, unless you're making swales to restore it, like, or you have to dig it a hole for a tree or something. But you know, gardening tells you should dig the soil, when you're growing food, but it, overexposure to oxygen kills off all the bacteria and microorganisms beneath the soil, the mycelium, fungi. You're better off doing no dig systems. I don't know if you know what that is.
Mm-mm. No.
No dig is the easiest way to grow food. It's so cool. You basically take, some of your lawn or whatever it is you've got, whatever area you have, and you put cardboard down, maybe a couple of layers, um, poke some holes in it so that there's breathable, that there's, the soil can breathe. You soak the cardboard and then you cover it with, a few inches of organic peat-free compost. And then you just sow your veggies into that. And it's the best way of growing food because you don't have to dig, you don't have to do anything. You can put an edge on it if you want, um, little wooden edges or stone edges or terracotta ends or whatever you want. But you don't have to. I find it's best not to because snails and slugs like those little edges. And my vegetable garden, now that it's surrounded by an arc, I don't have any problems because the balance is back and the birds eat everything that I would normally be struggling against.
I've never heard of that. No digging. And there's probably videos on YouTube that people
Oh,
can.
it's called no dig. That's all it's called. No dig vegetable growing.
That
It's easy.
sounds
Mm.
easy.
It's so easy. I know. It's so easy. It's so great. And so the grass or, whatever is underneath just dies off and contributes to the nutrients.
Can you speak to mulch and what it is? And also, like, the kind of traditional way that we see is rake your lawn in the fall, in the autumn, take the leaves to the landfill, mow your lawn, take the grass to the landfill. That's kind of what we've been programmed to do. And so mulch, as I understand it, is like the dead leaves, the dead bark, all that kind of stuff, and the dead grass, and using that to create the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, by taking away the leaves, number one, what happens is that's all about protecting the lawn, you know, and keeping everything tidy. But those leaves are a vital part of the life cycle of many creatures in the winter. And so by raking them away or, using that hellish implement, the leaf blower,
Mm.
burning all the little creatures that are living within the leaves is a disaster. And by allowing the leaves to fall and lay where they fall, it's number one, allowing a lot of larvae to complete their life cycles. A lot of little mammals use those, that winter blanket basically to survive throughout the winter, the blanket of leaves. And also, it kills off the grass, which in an arc system is quite good because it allows space then for other annual wildflowers to come up. And they might be things that we consider weeds, but as long as they're native, they're going to have a really important role to play, and we shouldn't be taking them out. You might have them in a mown area, and that's okay. Mow them, and they'll still manage to survive within the mown areas. Generally, it depends on the plant, and sometimes they won't. But if you don't need it to be a mown area, just keep some of it mown, which allows certain birds, access to foraging, and different creatures are supported by a mown area. And then also, the trees drop their leaves and the grass clippings. That's nutrients returning to the soil. And we're taking away all the food, and the soil is being starved of that replenishment every year. So it makes no sense. It's just our mindset. And once you start to see all these creatures return, your heart opens up to embrace every single one of them. So you never feel anything other than what else can I do? Because when you're aware of the collapse of nature all around us, all of us are extremely upset about it, that are aware of it and who care. Um, this is a game changer. This is the one thing that gives people hope.
Mm.
By restoring. If you want to save the planet, then you're going to have to start with your own patch of it. You've got to let go of the whole concept of the garden, and you've got to embrace the concept of an ark, and to kind of just see how many creatures can you support in here. And your heart literally opens up to embrace all of them into your family. It's really amazing.
Mm.
what happens. And you leave your ark then, and you go out and you see all these controlled spaces, and suddenly you see how ridiculous it all is. What are we doing? You know, um, and it changes everything. And when you see how quickly nature recovers, it really does give you hope. And how quickly creatures turn up, like it's like they're desperate. So it's just amazing, really. Just it's a really positive action to take.
It's something everybody can do with
Yeah,
their own space. So that is very inspiring and gives hope that we
and
can shift around this state that we're in.
totally. And I ask people to make a sign, make their own sign. It doesn't have to be fancy, like just anything that says this is an ark, with the
Mm.
website underneath, that you can stick up for your neighbors, so that they understand what's happening. So they don't just think, oh, she's lost the plot. She's just, somebody needs to go and help her to tidy
Mm.
up. Because people will come in and tidy up for you. You have to be careful. You'll find your neighbor out spraying chemicals, thinking they're doing a favor, or
Mm.
they'll feel sorry for you, whatever it is. But if you educate them with that simple sign and the website as a reference, it changes everything, and it inspires other people to do the same. And I know in America, or are you in Canada or America? Apologies,
Canada,
in Canada. Well,
West
I
Coast.
know.
Yeah.
So in America, they have these things called homeowners associations. Do you guys have them as well?
I think, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So in homeowners associations, you're not allowed to do anything. However, in every organization, there are people who want to change. And we're finding in our ARC group, we have like a Facebook group called We Are the ARC. And in that group, I found there's a few people who are approaching their homeowners associations, and they've got them on board to turn the gardens into ARCs, which is huge.
That's
And
huge.
once that starts to happen, there's a good chance we can turn it all around very, very quickly, you know?
Mm. Hmm. Can you speak to compost tea? I remember after I read The Garden Awakening, I was living in the mountains at that time, and I literally wanted to start spraying compost tea everywhere as a way to rebuild the soil. So it feels like a powerful thing that the everyday person can do.
Yeah.
Compost tea.
Well, I have my own weird way of making compost teas, but you can look up online. There's loads of really cool ones. Like the one I make is weird, but I'll tell you about my one. But um, what I do is I get a big barrel of rainwater or spring water, or I don't tend to use tap water because there's so many chemicals in it, and particularly the chlorine, it kills off all the bacteria in the water, which is or in the soil, which is what the opposite of what we want to do here, and it also kills bacteria in your own gut seat. It's not good stuff. So but if you can only use tap water, then if you let it stand for 24 hours at least, the chlorine dissipates at least. So that's better than nothing. And then you go and get just one handful of soil, if you can, with permission from an old woodland, an established woodland, an old local old soil, if you
Mm.
can, and ask permission from the land as well. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it. And if it looks like, don't do it if there's too much disturbance there already or whatever. But just one handful is all, as long as it's okay and it feels okay, and the landowner doesn't mind and all that stuff. Um, and bring it back and put it into the barrel of water with a cup full of molasses. Do you know what molasses is? It's like a big
Mhm.
sugar stuff, or some kind of big sugar stuff. And then if you can get a pond aerator and stick it in, a bubbler thing,
Mhm.
24 hours, it just makes it a lot easier because you can walk away and let that bubble away for 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, you have a day before it all goes bad, because if you leave it longer than 48 hours, they all start to eat each other, all these microorganisms. It's just they start eating each other because they've overpopulated the water. So you then spray. You can Also stir intentions into water using a big stick. You can stir, whatever intention you have for your land in, um, and you do it in big swirls, like they do in biodynamic preparations. And you can talk into it, or you can think into it, or you can write it on the barrel itself. It doesn't matter as long as the intention is all around the water in the barrel. Um, and then you have this wonderful huge supply of organisms, which you then pour on your soil or sprinkle on your soil or whatever, and reestablish it. Now, don't do that unless there's plants there for them to work with. Like, I wouldn't put it onto bare soil, you know. Um,
Mm.
and then, yeah, that really helps. Is that the one you were hoping to hear about?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That sounds beautiful and relatively easy
Yeah.
to do. So it's not something super complex. And you spoke to asking permission
Mm.
from the land, and that's like asking permission from the trees, from the land. Can you speak to that ancient practice and how people can start to bring it back? Because I think it's such a beautiful way to be in communion with the land as opposed to just taking from the land.
So I guess it's just the understanding that everything's alive.
Mm.
Everything, every stone, every tree, every drop of water, every creature, every person, everything. We're all alive, and it's all this magical web of life that, we keep pulling the threads out of, and our job is to look after it. And so, you know, there's a communication that happens, which is heart based, and, you know, you just have to practice because you think you're totally nuts and, you're talking away to something through your heart or not using your voice either, but it's a heart based voice, it's different energy. Um, and you're just asking for um, permission if it doesn't. And what I mean by that is like everything has character and individuality. So, like, there's some days somebody might come up to me and say, you know, will you come for a cup of tea or whatever it is that people might ask, and some days I might want to say, no, I really don't feel up to that today. Simple as. And the same with everything else. Like,
Mm.
so if you are cutting down a tree, for example, that's a difficult one because sometimes you just have to. There's just the situation is that you have to, or you're cutting your food, you're killing a plant to eat it, or whatever it is. And that's why the world was of our ancestors and of people that live still, the indigenous peoples that still live in harmony with the world. It was full of ritual.
Mm.
Um, the ritual was to communicate and say thank you and be in service and gratitude for what you took, to constantly be in gratitude and service back to nature for what you've done. And so the communication is very simple. You have to be like, if I'm going to be cutting down a tree, I let it know the day before, and if I'm going to move it or if I'm going to cut it to the base. And if I'm going to cut it to the base, like coppice it, I'll tell it that it has to pull all its energy back into its roots.
Mm.
And I'll be coming back at the same time tomorrow to do it. And there's a respect in that and they accept that. If you just come along and hack at it, it's a different scenario altogether. Um, and it's the same with your food, and it's the same with taking a handful of soil. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it. Like, I learned this when I was young and I was starting off and as a designer, and this story is in the Garden Awakening, and I was doing a TV makeover for a garden in Ireland, and we were doing it with you know a wing and a prayer. Like, there was no money involved or anything, so I was like begging and borrowing and stealing everything I could to make this little garden. And I remember I had just bought a new little van, um, and I was bursting along this road, and I was full of ego and full of how exciting it was to be working in television world and all this sort of thing. um, I noticed on this little country road there was a hill up to one side over this big stone wall covered in trees, and there was this incredibly beautiful piece of a branch of a tree that was all twisted and gnarled, and I saw it and I thought, wow, that would be fabulous in the garden. And I stopped the van, I pulled in, and I jumped over the wall and went to get the piece of wood, and I didn't ask permission.
Mm.
I just took it. But the minute I lifted it up and took it, this feeling came over me very, very strongly, like I was in serious trouble with my mother, that kind of feeling. If anybody else knows that
Mhm.
Irish mammy feeling where you're absolutely terrified. And I kind of knew something was, I couldn't understand, because I had disconnected from all that stuff. And so, but I knew there was something wrong. And I walked back to the car and I just felt guilty, and I felt, this is weird. And I just ignored it, and I threw the piece of wood back into the boot. It was sticking out, and got into the car and turned the key. Didn't think too much of it, but the key wouldn't work. The car wouldn't start. It was completely dead. And I've always found this with my cars. They reflect. They are very much message. They give me messages all the time. Anyway, there was no move in that car. It was just no life in it. And I called the garage, and somebody came out, and it turned out that the earth wire had been disconnected from the engine.
Oh.
And so it was a very strong, it was a very strong message. So I gingerly got out um, when the guy had fixed it, and I took the piece of wood and I put it back and I apologized. And from then on, I started to wake up and remember who I was and who we are, and how our connections are very um, sacred. And until we start treating the earth as a sacred being,
Mm.
we won't get to stay here anymore. We'll be, she'll have to push us off to survive and look after all of our other children.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that it was such a blatant message. There was no gray area with that. It's clear as mud,
Yeah,
straight for
yeah.
you. How do you kind of suggest to people to start to commune with the land on what the land wants to become, like getting that insight from the land as to how it wants to grow and thrive?
Well, it wants to be a community of native plants.
Mm.
The native plants are what restore. They're like the foundation stone of what's above and below the soil. So um, then, in terms of the shapes and patterns that you create within that, um, yeah, that's a whole course, like, that's, but it's like, I suppose if I'm working with a client, I'll try and I do a lot of research in history, and I talk to the clients and try and find out if there's any symbols or patterns or poems or songs or anything that means something really strongly to them. And there's usually something within that reflects the land as well, because we're attracted to pieces of land that have the same kind of damage that we have. The land draws us in. And so, I always tell people that, my land here is clearly has issues with rejection and abandonment. And it takes, you know, takes a long time for it to bother connecting, because there's this kind of, it rejects you before you reject it. And I'm very like that as well, like. Um, and yeah, no, as I work with it, it's gradually getting better, and so am I. And that's how it works, is you you heal your land, and you find you're healing your own issues as you go. And it's kind of a backwards way of going around getting well, because most people find it hard to get well by other means. It's a lot of work, but if you're working on something which is actually an extension of you, um, it's quite an interesting and different process.
Yeah. What I receive from that is like cultivating a relationship with the land, and that like the union between the two of you. And so when you're getting insights into things, it's like coming from the land, like you're mirroring each other on your healing path. And so
That's it.
cultivating that relationship. I just moved to the ocean So now I'm
Oh,
like, ooh, I wonder what what the waters are reflecting for me at this time on
yeah, as
my
you said,
healing path.
you get into the water.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And that's so healing. So for you with your garden, so I haven't actually been able to go to one, but I have a friend in Ireland and she sends me pictures because she's visited some of your gardens, and there's such a different feel to them. Like there's such an energy and a wildness. So is there a process to how that's cultivated, or is it kind of you sinking into the land, just like you spoke of, and you allowing it to speak to you, and then you guys working in union as to what it wants to become?
Um, there is a process, I guess, but it's different for every piece of land. It's like meeting a person. Different people,
Mm.
you know, some of them are really friendly and really want to get to know you, and some of them just don't. And you mightn't connect with some of them, and it's all a bit of a, you know, who knows what you're going to meet until you meet it. And then it is, I mean, it's the same answer as last question, really. It's just like, getting to know the people who reflect it.
Mm.
You know, really looking at what kind of an ecosystem would be there if it was allowed to be, like getting to know the type of soil it is, the type of situation that's there, Um, it's just takes a while. It's like getting to know something, and then you work with it and you work with the client's requirements, and you try and find a balance between that and what the land it wants to do itself. And generally, most land wants to become woodland. And in an arc, what we're doing is if you have enough land to allow as much of it as you can become woodland, and then have as many different layers and breaks in there as possible, because all the life is in the edges between different systems. So the life is in
Mm.
the edge between a meadow and a lawn, or a thick, thorny, scrubby area and a woodland, or um, the edges of a pond. Um,
Mm.
all the life is in the edges. So you try and create as many edges as possible, and um, by creating spaces within an ecosystem, you're creating lots of edges. So it's a good thing. So you can be part of it, and you can walk around and chat to everything, and sit and watch and get to know all the dragonflies, or whatever comes to visit your part of the world. I work with people all over the world on their arcs, and sometimes like it's just amazing. Like one woman, I remember, she had a serious alligator problem, you know, and she was trying to allow the alligators to live with her, but it's quite an interesting kind of complicated consultation process, that one. But anyway,
Wow. She had the alligators. Yeah.
yeah.
Being in communion with them, that's wild. I
Yeah,
loved that, thinking about what the land would be if you weren't here. That feels like we can all envision what our backyards would be if that hadn't been developed, and starting to allow it to come
yes.
back to that space.
Support it to come back. Support it to
Mm,
come, a very different thing. And
yeah.
that's what arcing is all about. And it's a wonderful process, and it doesn't have to cost anything, you know? That's the really cool thing about it. I mean, they're in now in Canada is different. I know there's some really great native plant nurseries and things like that, but over here there really isn't. And you know, so it's all about seed sharing with your friends, and getting cuttings, and you know,
Mm,
going back to doing things in a really simple way. Um, and you don't have to spend money. It does involve a little bit of planning and work, but you know, leaving it and taking out the non-native plants is brilliant. If you can just do that much, you're flying. Um,
yeah.
that's it, really.
Beautiful. Simple, really. You want to speak briefly to the book
Oh yeah,
before we
the art.
close?
Sure. Well, it's a really hopeful book. It talks about um, very very practical how to build an ark, no matter where you are in the world. But it also talks about the solutions to lots of other stuff, um, and uh, how it's a lot about food, and how we need to change the way we treat our sewage. It's like all the things we need to stop doing. And there's lots of solutions in the book. Um, if you want to delve more into the solutions that exist, I would highly recommend Paul Hawkins' book, Regeneration,
Mm.
Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. He has all the solutions in there, but this one is specifically solutions about biodiversity and nature, and restoring nature to as many patches, and creating a patchwork quilt of hope. You know, that's the plan. And it's a secret. My secret world domination plan is to get everybody to let go of their gardens and to either grow their own food and give the rest back to her.
Mm. Beautiful. And when does it come out?
Next week,
Next week. Oh, okay.
Tuesday,
Very exciting.
the 25th of October. So yeah, not sure if it'll be next week on your podcast, but it's the 25th of October in real time.
Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, it'll be in the show notes where everybody can look out for that book and experience its magic. And it was really beautiful having you on the show. So thank you so much for this conversation. And yeah, I look forward to reading the new book for sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining me for an episode of the Phoenix Rising podcast. Please like, share, download, subscribe if you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week for another episode on the Phoenix Rising podcast. Sending so much love.